A complex is an agglomeration of associations, a sort of picture of a more or less complicated psychological nature, sometimes of traumatic character, sometimes simply of a painful and highly toned character. Everything that is highly toned is rather difficult to handle. If, for instance, something is very important to me, I begin to hesitate when I attempt to do it. And you have probably observed that when you ask me difficult questions, I cannot answer them immediately because the subject is important and I have a long reaction time. I begin to stammer and my memory does not supply the necessary material. Such disturbances are complex disturbances, even if what I say does not come from a personal complex of mine. It is simply an important affair, and whatever has an intense feeling tone is difficult to handle because such contents are somehow associated with physiological reactions, with the processes of the heart, the tonus of the blood vessels, the condition of the intestines, the breathing, and the innervation of the skin. Whenever there is a high tonus, it is just as if that particular complex had a body of its own, as if it were localized in my body to a certain extent. And that makes it unwieldy because something that irritates my body cannot be easily pushed away because it has its roots in my body and begins to pull at my nerves. Something that has little tonus and little emotional value can be easily brushed aside because it has no roots. It is not adherent or adhesive. Ladies and gentlemen, that leads me to something very important, the fact that a complex with its given tension or energy has the tendency to form a little personality of itself. It has a sort of body, a certain amount of its own physiology. It can upset the stomach, it upsets the breathing, it disturbs the heart. In short, it behaves like a partial personality. For instance, when you want to say or do something and unfortunately a complex interferes with this intention, then you say or do something different from what you intended. You are simply interrupted, and your best intention gets upset by the complex. Exactly as if you had been interfered with by a human being or by circumstances from outside. Under those conditions, we really are forced to speak of the tendencies of complexes to act as if they were characterized by a certain amount of willpower. When you speak of willpower, you naturally ask about the ego. Where then is the ego that belongs to the willpower of the complexes? We know our own ego complex, which is supposed to be in full possession of the body. It is not, but let us assume that it is a center in full possession of the body, that there is a focus which we call the ego, and that the ego has a will and can do something with its components. The ego also is an agglomeration of highly toned contents, so that in principle there is no difference between the ego complex and any other complex. Because complexes have a certain willpower, a sort of ego, we find that in a schizophrenic condition they emancipate themselves from conscious control to such an extent that they become visible and audible. They appear as visions. They speak in voices which are like the voices of definite people. This personification of complexes is not in itself necessarily a pathological condition. In dreams, for instance, our complexes often appear in a personified form, and one can train oneself to such an extent that they become visible or audible also in a waking condition. It is part of a certain yoga training to split up consciousness into its components, each of which appears as a specific personality. In the psychology of our unconscious, there are typical figures that have a definite life of their own, attuned to us. All this is explained by the fact that the so-called unity of consciousness is an illusion. It is really a wish dream. We like to think that we are one, but we are not, most decidedly not. We are not really masters in our house. We like to believe in our willpower and in our energy and in what we can do, but when it comes to a real showdown, we find that we can do it only to a certain extent, because we are hampered by those little devils, the complexes. Complexes are autonomous groups of associations that have a tendency to move by themselves, to live their own life apart from our intentions. I hold that our personal unconscious, as well as the collective unconscious, consists of an indefinite, because unknown, number of complexes or fragmentary personalities. This idea explains a lot. It explains, for instance, the simple fact that a poet has the capacity to dramatize and personify his mental contents. When he creates a character on the stage, or in his poem or drama or novel, He thinks it is merely a product of his imagination, but that character in a certain secret way has made itself. Any novelist or writer will deny that these characters have a psychological meaning, but as a matter of fact, you know as well as I do that they have one. Therefore, you can read a writer's mind when you study the characters he creates. The complexes, then, are partial or fragmentary personalities. When we speak of the ego complex, we naturally assume that it has a consciousness because the relationship of the various contents to the center, in other words, to the ego, is called consciousness. But we also have a grouping of contents about a center, a sort of nucleus, in other complexes. So we may ask the question, do complexes have a consciousness of their own? If you study spiritualism, you must admit that the so-called spirits manifested in automatic writing or through the voice of a medium do indeed have a sort of consciousness of their own. Therefore, unprejudiced people are inclined to believe that the spirits are the ghosts of a deceased aunt or grandfather or something of the kind, just on account of the more or less distinct personality which can be traced in these manifestations. Of course, when we are dealing with a case of insanity, we are less inclined to assume that we have to do with ghosts. We call it pathological then. So much about the complexes. I insist on that particular point of consciousness within complexes only because complexes play a large role in dream analysis. You remember my diagram, figure 4, showing the different spheres of the mind and the dark center of the unconscious in the middle. The closer you approach that center, the more you experience what Janet calls an abaissement du niveau mental. Your conscious autonomy begins to disappear, and you get more and more under the fascination of unconscious contents. Conscious autonomy loses its tension and its energy, and that energy reappears in the increased activity of unconscious contents. You can observe this process in an extreme form when you carefully study a case of insanity. The fascination of unconscious contents gradually grows stronger, and conscious control vanishes in proportion, until finally the patient sinks into the unconscious altogether and becomes completely victimized by it. He is the victim of a new autonomous activity that does not start from his ego, but starts from the dark sphere. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now going to step over the border into dreams. I do not want to give you any particular introduction to dream analysis. I think the best way is just to show you how I proceed with a dream. And then it does not need much explanation of a theoretical kind, because you can see what are my underlying ideas. Of course, I make great use of dreams because dreams are an objective source of information in psychotherapeutic treatment. When a doctor has a case, he can hardly refrain from having ideas about it. But the more one knows about cases, the more one should make an heroic effort not to know in order to give the patient a fair chance. I always try not to know and not to see. It is much better to say you are stupid or play what is apparently a stupid role in order to give the patient a chance to come out with his own material. That does not mean that you should hide altogether. This is a case of a man 40 years old, a married man who has not been ill before. He looks quite all right. He is the director of a great public school, a very intelligent fellow who has studied an old-fashioned kind of psychology, Wundt psychology, that has nothing to do with details of human life but moves in the stratosphere of abstract ideas. Recently, he had been badly troubled by neurotic symptoms. He suffered from a peculiar kind of vertigo that seized upon him from time to time, palpitation, nausea, and peculiar attacks of feebleness and a sort of exhaustion. This syndrome presents the picture of a sickness which is well known in Switzerland. It is mountain sickness, a malady to which people who are not used to great heights are easily subject when climbing. So I asked, "Is it not mountain sickness you are suffering from?" He said, "Yes, you are right. It feels exactly like mountain sickness." I asked him if he had dreams, and he said that recently he had had 3 dreams. I do not like to analyze one dream alone, because a single dream can be interpreted arbitrarily. You can speculate anything about an isolated dream, but if you compare a series of, say, 20 or 100 dreams, then you can see interesting things. You see the process that is going on in the unconscious from night to night, and the continuity of the unconscious psyche extending through day and night. Presumably we are dreaming all the time, although we are not aware of it by day because consciousness is much too clear. But at night, when there is that abaissement du niveau mental, the dreams can break through and become visible. In the first dream, the patient finds himself in a small village in Switzerland. He's a very solemn black figure in a long coat. Under his arm, he carries several thick books. There is a group of young boys whom he recognizes as having been his classmates. They are looking at him and they say, "That fellow does not often make his appearance here." In order to understand this dream, you have to remember that the patient is in a very fine position and has had a very good scientific education. But he started really from the bottom and is a self-made man. His parents were very poor, and he worked his way up to his present position. He is very ambitious and is filled with the hope that he will rise still higher. He is like a man who has climbed in one day from sea level to a level of 6,000 feet. And there he sees peaks 12,000 feet high towering above him. He finds himself in the place from which one climbs these higher mountains, and because of this, he forgets all about the fact that he has already climbed 6,000 feet, and immediately he starts to attack the higher peaks. But as a matter of fact, though he does not realize it, he is tired from his climbing and quite incapable of going any further at this time. This lack of realization is the reason for his symptoms of mountain sickness. The dream brings home to him the actual psychological situation. The contrast of himself as the solemn figure in the long black coat with thick books under his arm, appearing in his native village, and of the village boys remarking that he does not often appear there, means that he does not often remember where he came from. On the contrary, he thinks of his future career and hopes to get a chair as professor. Therefore, the dream puts him back into his early surroundings. He ought to realize how much he has achieved considering who he was originally and that there are natural limitations to human effort. The beginning of the second dream is a typical instance of the kind of dream that occurs when the conscious attitude is like his. He knows that he ought to go to an important conference, and he is taking his portfolio. But he notices that the hour is rather advanced and that the train will leave soon, and so he gets into that well-known state of haste and of fear of being too late. He tries to get his clothes together, his hat is nowhere, his coat is mislaid, and he runs about in search of them and shouts up and down the house, "Where are my things?" Finally, he gets everything together and runs out of the house only to find that he has forgotten his portfolio. He rushes back for it, and looking at his watch finds how late it is getting. Then he runs to the station, but the road is quite soft, so that it is like walking on a bog, and his feet can hardly move anymore. Pantingly, he arrives at the station only to see that the train is just leaving. Whenever one has this kind of dream of being late, of 100 obstacles interfering, it is exactly the same as when one is in such a situation in reality, when one is nervous about something. One is nervous because there is an unconscious resistance to the conscious intention. The most irritating thing is that consciously you want something very much, and an unseen devil is always working against it, and of course you are that devil too. You are working against this devil and do it in a nervous way and with nervous haste. In the case of this dreamer, that rushing ahead is also against his will. He does not want to leave home, yet he wants it very much, and all the resistance and difficulties in his way are his own doing. He is that engine driver who thinks, now we are out of our trouble. We have a straight line ahead, and now we can rush along like anything. The straight line beyond the curve would correspond to the peaks 12,000 feet high, and he thinks these peaks are accessible to him. Naturally, nobody seeing such a chance ahead would refrain from making the utmost use of it, so his reason says to him, "Why not go on? You have every chance in the world." He does not see why something in him should work against it. But this dream gives him a warning that he should not be as stupid as this engine driver who goes full steam ahead when the tail end of the train is not yet out of the curve. That is what we always forget. We always forget that our consciousness is only a surface. Our consciousness is the avant-garde of our psychological existence. Our head is only one end, But behind our consciousness is a long historical tale of hesitations and weaknesses and complexes and prejudices and inheritances, and we always make our reckoning without them. We always think we can make a straight line in spite of our shortcomings, but they will weigh very heavily. And often we derail before we have reached our goal because we have neglected our tail ends. I always say that our psychology has a long saurian's tail behind it, namely the whole history of our family, of our nation, of Europe, and of the world in general. We are always human, and we should never forget that we carry the whole burden of being only human. If we were heads only, we should be like little angels that have heads and wings. And of course they can do what they please because they are not hindered by a body that can walk only on the earth. The next dream is the crucial dream, and I shall have to give certain explanations. In this dream, we have to do with a peculiar animal which is half lizard and half crab. Before we go into the details of the dream, I want to make a few remarks about the method of working out the meaning of a dream. You know that there are many views and many misunderstandings as to the way in which you get at dreams. You know, for instance, what is understood by free association. This method is a very doubtful one as far as my experience goes. Free association means that you open yourself to any amount and kind of associations, and they naturally lead to your complexes. But then, you see, I do not want to know the complexes of my patients. That is uninteresting to me. I want to know what the dreams have to say about complexes, not what the complexes are. I want to know what a man's unconscious is doing with his complexes. I want to know what he is preparing himself for. That is what I read out of the dreams. If I wanted to apply the method of free association, I would not need dreams. I could put up a signboard, for instance, footpath to so-and-so, and simply let people meditate on that and add free associations, and they would invariably arrive at their complexes. If you are riding in a Hungarian or Russian train and look at the strange signs in the strange language, you can associate all your complexes. You have only to let yourself go, and you naturally drift into your complexes. I do not apply the method of free association because my goal is not to know the complexes. I want to know what the dream is. Therefore, I handle the dream as if it were a text which I do not understand properly, say a Latin or a Greek or a Sanskrit text, where certain words are unknown to me or the text is fragmentary, and I merely apply the ordinary method any philologist would apply in reading such a text. My idea is that the dream does not conceal. We simply do not understand its language. For instance, if I quote to you a Latin or a Greek passage, some of you will not understand it. But that is not because the text dissimulates or conceals. It is because you do not know Greek or Latin. Likewise, when a patient seems confused, it does not necessarily mean that he is confused, but that the doctor does not understand his material. The assumption that the dream wants to conceal is a mere anthropomorphic idea. No philologist would ever think that a difficult Sanskrit or cuneiform inscription conceals. There is a very wise word of the Talmud, which says that the dream is its own interpretation. The dream is the whole thing, and if you think there is something behind it, or that the dream has concealed something, there is no question but that you simply do not understand it. Therefore, first of all, when you handle a dream, you say, "I do not understand a word of that dream." I always welcome that feeling of incompetence because then I know I shall put some good work into my attempt to understand the dream. What I do is this. I adopt the method of the philologist, which is far from being free association, and apply a logical principle which is called amplification. It is simply that of seeking the parallels. For instance, in the case of a very rare word which you have never come across before, you try to find parallel text passages, parallel applications perhaps, where that word also occurs, and then you try to put the formula you have established from the knowledge of other texts into the new text. If you make the new text a readable whole, you say, "Now we can read it." That is how we learn to read hieroglyphics and cuneiform inscriptions, and that is how we can read dreams. Now, how do I find the context? Here I simply follow the principle of the association experiment. Let us assume a man dreams about a simple sort of peasant's house. Now, do I know what a simple peasant's house conveys to that man's mind? Of course not. How could I? Do I know what a simple peasant's house means to him in general? Of course not. So I simply ask, how does that thing appear to you? In other words, what is your context? What is the mental tissue in which that term simple peasant's house is embedded? He will tell you something quite astonishing. For instance, somebody says water. Do I know what he means by water? Not at all. When I put that test word or a similar word to somebody, he will say green. Another one will say H20, which is something quite different. Another one will say quicksilver. In each case, I know what tissue that word or image is embedded in. That is amplification. It is a well-known logical procedure which we apply here and which formulates exactly the technique of finding the context. Of course, I ought to mention here the merit of Freud, who brought up the whole question of dreams and who has enabled us to approach the problem of dreams at all. You know, his idea is that a dream is a distorted representation of a secret, incompatible wish, which does not agree with the conscious attitude and therefore is censored, that is distorted, in order to become unrecognizable to the conscious, and yet in a way to show itself and live. Freud logically says then, let us redress that whole distortion. Now be natural. Give up your distorted tendencies and let your associations flow freely. Then we will come to your natural facts, namely, your complexes. This is an entirely different point of view from mine. Freud is seeking the complexes, I am not. That is just the difference. I am looking for what the unconscious is doing with the complexes, because that interests me very much more than the fact that people have complexes. We all have complexes. It is only interesting to know what people do with their complexes. That is the practical question which matters. Freud applies the method of free association and makes use of an entirely different logical principle, a principle which in logic is called reductio in primum figurum, reduction to the first figure. The reductio in primum figurum is a so-called syllogism, a complicated sequence of logical conclusions whose characteristic is that you start from a perfectly reasonable statement, and through surreptitious assumptions and insinuations, you gradually change the reasonable nature of your first simple or prime figure until you reach a complete distortion which is utterly unreasonable. That complete distortion in Freud's idea characterizes the dream. The dream is a clever distortion that disguises the original figure, and you have only to undo the web in order to return to the first reasonable statement, which may be, I wish to commit this or that. I have such and such an incompatible wish. We start, for instance, with a perfectly reasonable assumption, such as no unreasonable being is free. In other words, has free will. This is an example which is used in logic. It is a fairly reasonable statement. Now we come to the first fallacy. Therefore, no free being is unreasonable. You cannot quite agree because there is already a trick. Then you continue, all human beings are free. They all have free will. Now you triumphantly finish up, therefore no human being is unreasonable. That is complete nonsense.